pay your taxes, mind your business, and keep Will Smith's wife's name out your mouth!
A violinist is suing Will Smith, claiming retaliation after
Jim Carrey warned everyone that Hollywood was broken. Eddie Murphy joked about powerful men getting exposed. Now, new claims surrounding Will Smith's 2025 world tour have people revisiting those old warnings. Was everyone seeing the same pattern years ago? And how much of what they saw has only now become impossible to ignore? Join us as we find out how much Jim Carrey and Eddie Murphy uncover to expose Will Smith. The spineless world. The moment Will Smith struck Chris Rock across the face on the Oscar stage in March 2022, the room went silent for 4 seconds. And then it was replaced with a standing ovation as Will went on to win Best Actor that same night. Walking to the podium with tears on his face, he delivered a speech about love and protecting family, and the same room that had just watched him assault a comedian applauded every word without hesitation. That sequence showed everyone watching at home exactly how the industry valued people, and it showed them in real time, on one of the year's most watched broadcasts. Jim Carrey was watching from home. What he described afterward was nausea, not because of the slap itself, but because of what the room chose to do immediately after it. He said Hollywood had revealed itself as spineless on a mass scale, and that the ovation was the clearest signal he had seen in decades that the entertainment world had forfeited any claim to moral authority it had ever held. He was on a press tour for a family film, not a platform built for controversy, and he said it because he meant it. Jim argued Will should have been removed from the building immediately after the slap. He said Chris's decision not to press charges was not forgiveness, it was exhaustion. A celebrity who files charges becomes the story for years. The depositions, the tabloid counter-narratives, the courtroom footage repurposed for content in every direction. Chris had no appetite for that process, and Jim said he understood it. The footage existed, and the humiliation was documented, and the person responsible should carry a financial consequence to match. He described a man who had spent 30 years building a public identity so thoroughly and so deliberately that any challenge to the image had stopped registering as criticism and started registering as a threat. The slap, Jim said, had nothing to do with love for Jada Pinkett Smith. It came from the accumulated frustration of a man who had fused his sense of self with his persona so completely that a comedian's joke landed in the same psychological place a physical attack would. Chris was simply standing in front of it when the pressure finally gave way. Eddie Murphy's moment came the following year. At the 2023 Golden Globes, accepting the Cecil B. DeMille Award for Lifetime Achievement, he closed his speech with what he called the career blueprint he had followed for 4 decades. Pay taxes, mind business, and keep Will Smith's wife's name out of the mouth. The room went loud. Backstage, Eddie told journalists it was not a joke. He said it worked because he meant it, and because every person in that building understood what it was aimed at. Eddie's credibility in that moment came from what he had spent his entire career refusing to do. When he lost Best Supporting Actor at the 2007 Oscars for Dreamgirls, he stood up and left the building before the winner was announced, rather than perform gracious disappointment for the cameras and the press seated around him. He had spent 4 decades avoiding ceremonies, skipping press obligations, and making no effort to conceal his contempt for what he saw as a culture of performance and mutual pretense. There is also a history between Jim and Will that has largely been forgotten. In the mid-19s, Will was among the actors considered for the lead role in The Mask, the film that made Jim the biggest comedy star on the planet, and earned over $350 million at the box office. Will did not get the role. Jim did. In the 2 years that followed, while Will was still working to establish himself in film, Jim became culturally untouchable overnight. People inside the industry at that time have described a bitterness in Will that never fully resolved, a sense that a door that should have opened for him had opened for someone else instead, and that someone else had walked through it into everything Will had been working toward. Janet Hubert played Aunt Vivian on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air from 1990 until she was replaced in 1993. The explanation that traveled through Hollywood: she was difficult, she was unprofessional, she wanted more than she was entitled to, and she resented the star of the show. Janet spent years unable to book work at the level she had maintained before Fresh Prince. She was not blacklisted through any formal mechanism. She was simply made radioactive by a story that had been told about her, efficiently and repeatedly, by people with more power than she had. When she sat beside Will in a 2020 reunion special and told her version of what had actually happened, the account differed from the official story in almost every particular. She had been in a contract negotiation. She had asked for pay she considered fair and declined terms she found exploitative. When she refused to accept the offer, the apparatus around Will moved against her. Will, who held more structural power on that production than almost anyone else involved, led the effort to establish her as the problem. Janet described losing her reputation, her career trajectory, and years of her professional life to a label applied specifically to redirect attention from a dispute she had every right to raise. Neither Jim nor Eddie coordinated. They spoke at different times, from different platforms, without any shared plan, but both pointed at the same man during the same specific window. This window opened at the 2022 Oscars and was still open in 2025 when two people who had been inside Will's world filed lawsuits within weeks of each other, and 3 million pages of federal documents became public. A high-profile federal case put the entire entertainment industry's decades of silence under scrutiny. It could not avoid it. In September 2024, federal agents arrested Diddy on charges of serious criminal allegations and racketeering.
Federal agents took Sean Diddy Combs into custody. They placed Combs under arrest and lead him out the front door in handcuffs.
Within 48 hours, Will's name was being pulled into that conversation. He stopped a concert mid-show to deny it. But it was not the denial that people kept coming back to. It was the specific thing he chose to make a joke about while delivering it. The joke nobody could forget. The indictment described a criminal enterprise running through his business entities, one that used physical violence, coercion, and sustained psychological manipulation to force victims into intimate performances that Diddy internally called freak-offs. Among the physical evidence recovered from his properties during the arrest operation were over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Social media moved faster than the news cycle. Within hours of the arrest, decades of industry photographs and event footage were being pulled from archives and recirculated with new questions attached. Will's name appeared quickly. He and Diddy had shared stages and appeared in photographs together going back to the 1997 MTV Movie Awards, the 1998 Grammys, and various Hollywood industry events across the late 90s and early 2000s. Will had attended a party hosted by Diddy in Miami in 2004. For two men operating at the same level of the entertainment industry across overlapping decades, that history of contact was unremarkable. But placed inside the context of a federal high-profile case investigation, every shared image shifted from a photograph into something that needed to be accounted for. The volume of public speculation grew large enough that Will felt the need to stop a December 2024 concert in San Diego mid-show to address it. He then said he had nothing to do with Diddy, that he had not been near him, and that anyone suggesting otherwise was lying. Then he added a joke. He said he did not even like baby oil. The baby oil was not a pop culture reference or a broad comedic image. It was the specific forensic evidence that had been featured in global news coverage of an active federal high-profile case investigation for the preceding 3 months. Multiple fact-checking organizations confirmed afterward that no verified evidence places Will inside Diddy's alleged criminal enterprise, and he has not been charged with anything connected to the case. But a man with no genuine connection to a high-profile case investigation does not typically arrive at the physical evidence from that investigation as the detail he reaches for when trying to make people laugh. Diddy's federal trial opened in May 2025. By the time jury selection began,
Sean Diddy Combs now set to go to trial. A federal judge setting a May 5th trial date for the music mogul.
More than 120 serious civil allegations had been filed against him independently of the federal charges. The trial ran for weeks and became the event through which the entertainment industry was forced, in public and in real time, to account for what it had permitted across decades. Testimony described events that had allegedly occurred inside some of the most recognizable venues in American entertainment. Every name that surfaced as a defendant a witness, a peripheral figure, or simply someone photographed at the same event in the wrong year, was examined by an audience that had stopped accepting proximity as an explanation. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Testimony from multiple witnesses described events spanning 3 decades across properties in New York, Los Angeles, Miami, and the Caribbean. Jaguar Wright had publicly named Diddy as a predator years before the arrest, at a time when that position meant being dismissed and marginalized by the same press organizations that would later dedicate weeks to covering his trial. Around the time of the arrest, she described conditions inside certain levels of the industry where access and protection were maintained through relationships that never surfaced in public and never appeared in any written agreement. The arrest confirmed what she had been saying and made people pay attention to the other names she had placed in the same sentences. The history between Diddy and Will was visible, and long enough that speculation did not require fabrication. It only required the context the arrest had just provided. Will had spent 30 years at the center of the same industry that the trial was now exposing. He had been one of its most financially valuable figures. He had been accommodated, shielded, and excused in ways that less profitable people were not, and the Oscars' standing ovation had demonstrated that dynamic on live television. His December 2024 denial did not address that history. It addressed a meme, and within weeks, something came to light that made the baby oil joke feel straightforward compared to what followed. In January 2026, the Department of Justice released the Epstein files. The public had spent years expecting a list of names that would finally identify who had been inside the network. What arrived instead was something that could not be contained inside a list, because the story the documents told was never about individual names. It was about how the architecture of protection around powerful men in entertainment had been constructed and how it had been maintained across decades. The question those documents raised about Will was not whether his name appeared inside them. The DOJ memo said there was no client list and no blackmail operation. 18,000 of Jeffrey's personal emails told a different story. And what they described about how his network actually functioned explains more about Will's 30 years in Hollywood than anything a list of names ever could. The network nobody named. The Epstein Files Transparency Act passed both chambers of Congress in November 2025 and was signed into law the same day it reached the president's desk. The Department of Justice released an initial batch of materials in December 2025 that drew immediate bipartisan criticism for redactions so heavy that key sections were rendered illegible, and for a scope that fell well short of what the legislation had required. The main release followed on January 30, 2026. Over 3 million pages covering 2 decades, along with 2,000 videos and 180,000 images touching figures across finance, politics, science, and entertainment. The DOJ had attempted to preempt the public reaction in July 2025 with a memo concluding that no formal client list existed in the Epstein materials. No credible evidence supported claims of systematic blackmail, and that Jeffrey Epstein's 2019 death was a mental health crisis-related death.
Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide overnight. He was found dead in his lower Manhattan jail cell.
The memo was written to close the question before the documents could open it further, but it had the opposite effect. The public had never asked about a list. The question had always been about how the network operated, how it was built, how it stayed intact across decades, who benefited from its silence, and what the people inside it had actually agreed to. Bloomberg News had already answered part of that question. In September 2025, the outlet independently obtained approximately 18,000 emails from one of Jeffrey's personal accounts, covering the period between 2002 and 2022. 4 independent cryptographic experts verified the cache before it was published. The emails did not show a blackmailer at work, but a man whose central function in almost every significant relationship he maintained was access. Jeffrey introduced powerful people to other powerful people, created proximity between individuals who benefited from knowing each other, and facilitated arrangements that required discretion. More than 150 individuals appeared in the unsealed documents from the Ghislaine Maxwell civil case. Most were referenced briefly. The court had explicitly noted that being named was not evidence of criminal conduct. Several of those named had already addressed their connection to Jeffrey publicly. Others had not, but what the documents provided, beyond any name, was a detailed portrait of how a protection arrangement operates at the highest levels of an industry, through favors, through shared exposure, through the understanding that every person inside the circle has contributed to a situation that none of them can afford to have examined. In the entertainment-specific correspondence, the pattern was consistent. Introductions made, events attended, favors extended. Nobody was ever asked directly for anything. The arrangement operated on the understanding that access had a cost, and that the cost would be collected at a time and in a form that suited the person holding the debt. Alexis Arquette, before her death, had made specific claims about the circumstances surrounding Will's first marriage to Cherie Zampino in the early 1990s. The marriage ended quickly. Alexis alleged she knew why.
Cherie, how long did it take when you went through your divorce with Will?
For me to start dating? Oh, I dated right away.
And that what Cherie had discovered involved Will and his then manager, Benny Medina. The claim was never litigated and never addressed by Will. It circulated for years in the spaces that exist specifically because the mainstream press had decided not to touch it, known to people close enough to the industry to have heard it, protected by everyone who had a reason to keep it unexamined. Bilal Salam had spent years inside Will's inner circle. In accounts he gave before his lawsuit was filed, he described walking in on Will and actor Dwayne Martin in a hotel dressing room during the Fresh Prince era. The account was specific, made by someone with a documented history of direct access to Will's world, and no major outlet investigated it. It was noted, set aside, placed in the same category as the Arquette allegations, unverified, unlitigated, and maintained in circulation by the people who had heard it directly. When Bilal filed his lawsuit against Jada in December 2025, those earlier accounts surfaced again in a context that made them harder to dismiss. Jim called Hollywood spineless in 2022, and Eddie delivered his line at the Golden Globes in 2023. Neither of them mentioned Jeffrey by name, and neither needed to. Both were describing, from direct experience inside the industry, the conditions that the Epstein emails had now documented in writing, a world in which certain things were known and never discussed, where the protection of valuable people was institutional rather than incidental, and where the cost of speaking was calibrated carefully against the cost of silence. Will had been one of the most protected figures inside that world for 30 years, and the people who had been closest to him were beginning, one by one, to calculate whether staying quiet was still the safer option. Two of them filed lawsuits in December 2025. The first was a violinist named Brian King Joseph, who had been brought into Will's tour as part of his inner circle. The second was Bilal Salam himself, whose claim was not against Will but against Jada, and who alleged she had told him he would end up missing if he kept writing. The details in both filings described something specific and operational, not a pattern of general misconduct, but a mechanism for managing people who had seen too much and were showing signs of being willing to say so. Brian came back to his hotel room during Will's Las Vegas tour stop to find that someone had been inside while he was gone. Hotel security confirmed no forced entry. The access logs showed that only one group of people had key credentials for that door. Who left the note, the HIV medication, and the heart drawn in handwriting promising to return, and what happened to Brian the moment he reported it. The note on the pillow. Brian King Joseph is 33 years old and came to broad public attention in 2018 when he won America's Got Talent as a classically trained violinist. Will hired him to perform at a concert in San Diego in November 2024. What followed, according to the lawsuit Brian filed in December 2025, was not simply a professional engagement that expanded into a touring role. It was a process. Will told Brian early in their working relationship that they shared a connection, unlike anything he had with anyone else on the tour. Brian was invited to join the full global tour, contribute to the album's production, and be present as part of the inner circle that traveled with Will between cities and countries. By March 2025, he was among the people Will's team brought to Las Vegas. After a performance at the Las Vegas stop, Brian returned to his hotel room to find it had been entered while he was away. The door showed no signs of forced entry. Inside the room, arranged across its surfaces, were the following: wipes, a beer bottle, a red backpack, an earring, a bottle of HIV medication bearing a name Brian did not recognize, and hospital discharge paperwork issued to an individual he did not know. There was also a handwritten note. It read, "Brian, I will be back no later than 5:30, just us." Below the words, someone had drawn a heart. Below the heart, a name, Stone F. Brian contacted hotel security after discovering the room, called a local non-emergency police line, and reached Will's management team directly. Security investigated the room and pulled the access records for his door. Their finding was unambiguous. There were no signs of forced entry, and the door access log showed that only individuals from the management team, the specific group that had booked the room under the tour's account, held active key credentials during the window in question. Brian told Will's representatives that he was afraid whoever had written the note would return and attempt to have intercourse with him. Within 3 days of making those reports, Brian received a meeting request from a representative of Will's production operation. He was told that everyone who had been contacted was saying nothing had happened in that room. He was told he had fabricated the incident. 3 days later, his involvement was no longer required. A replacement violinist was identified and placed on the tour within days of his removal. On December 30th, 2025, Brian filed suit in Los Angeles County Superior Court against Will and his company, Trayball Studios Management. The complaint alleged wrongful termination, improper harassment, retaliation, and a deliberate pattern of grooming Brian for intimate exploitation that had, according to the filing, begun from their earliest professional contact. Will's attorney, Alan Grodsky, issued a statement describing every allegation as false and reckless, and stated that legal measures would be taken against Brian in response. The case has no trial date. 3 weeks after Brian's filing, a second lawsuit landed in the California court system. Bilal Salam, known publicly as Brother Bilal, and documented as a man with sustained close access to Will over multiple decades, filed a $3 million complaint in Los Angeles County Superior Court. The target of the lawsuit was Jada, not Will. The complaint described events beginning after the 2022 Oscars incident, when Bilal helped the Smith family manage the public damage from the slap, when he subsequently began working on a memoir that would draw on his years inside the Smith circle, and when Jada learned he had been discussing her personal life with people outside that circle, the situation changed. According to the complaint, she confronted him at a gathering with approximately 7 members of her entourage present. Bilal's complaint states that at that gathering, Jada told him he would catch a bullet or end up missing if he continued. She also allegedly pressured him to execute a non-disclosure agreement. Bilal claimed the confrontation caused lasting psychological damage, forced him to leave the United States for close to 2 years, and destroyed both a professional trajectory and a personal relationship. He sought $3 million in damages across 3 counts of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Jada's legal team challenged the claims in court on evidentiary grounds. Her attorneys argued that Bilal had produced no medical records, no psychological evaluation, and no professional documentation to support any element of the harm he described. His stated damages were that he had gained weight and ended a relationship. The court agreed that those assertions, unsupported by any documentation, fell short of the legal threshold for emotional distress claims. In April 2026, a California judge dismissed the bulk of the complaint and ordered Bilal to pay Jada's legal costs, $48,975. Remaining claims from the original filing are still active before the court. Neither lawsuit has reached an outcome. Brian's has no trial date, and Bilal's complaint is partially alive, partially dismissed. But both filings put specific, documented, named allegations into the public record within weeks of the Epstein document release, from 2 individuals whose access to Will's world was not speculative. Those 2 lawsuits did not describe anything new. The playbook behind them had been running for over a decade. 30 years, 1 playbook. In 2012, during production of Men in Black 3 in New York, Will demanded that the production provide him with a 53-foot double-decker trailer for $2 million. It was positioned on residential streets in Soho for the duration of the shoot. It blocked traffic, generated continuous noise and fumes, and created documented economic damage for the businesses and residents in the surrounding area. Formal complaints were filed by multiple parties. Will refused to have the trailer relocated. He owned a luxury apartment in Manhattan. He kept the trailer where it was because he had decided to, and every person with the authority to override that decision concluded it was not worth the difficulty. The Red Table Talk episode in which Jada admitted to a relationship with August Alsina ran the same playbook: a controlled environment, a selected narrative, and damage redirected away from questions about Will's own behavior. The episode was produced under their own banner, filmed in a controlled environment they owned, and framed from the beginning to position Will as the wounded but ultimately forgiving partner. It had itself been prompted by a claim from August that Will had personally given his blessing before the relationship began, a claim Will denied until Jada's confirmation made the denial untenable. The broadcast redirected public conversation away from questions about his own behavior that had been circulating inside and around the industry for years, and functioned as one of the most effective narrative management operations either of them had executed. The broadcast redirected public conversation away from questions about his own behavior that had been circulating inside and around the industry for years. It was received as a moment of radical transparency and functioned as one of the most effective narrative management operations either of them had executed. The 2025 music comeback followed the same structure. Will released his fifth studio album in March 2025, signed a multi-picture deal with Paramount Pictures that included a new action project and an I Am Legend sequel with Michael B. Jordan attached, and launched a global tour. The rehabilitation story was constructed and deployed the same way every previous narrative had been managed, with controlled imagery, selected press access, and a clear arc from mistake to accountability to return. Then people began examining the promotional footage. Tour videos posted to his official YouTube channel showed dense, enthusiastic crowds responding to performances. Multiple viewers independently identified what they described as visual artifacts: repeating motion patterns in the background, uniform crowd behavior inconsistent with real human variability, and elements suggesting portions of the footage had been digitally generated or augmented. Will's team issued no response. The comment sections filled with a particular quality of contempt, not the heat of a new scandal, but the cold flatness of an audience that had reached a decision. One observation that spread widely noted that Will appeared to have an almost compulsive relationship with public humiliation, that releasing footage of artificially generated crowds holding misspelled signs professing he had saved their lives meant he had lost the ability to tell the difference between what was real and what he had decided to present as real. Jim said what he said from a press junket for a children's movie. Eddie said what he said from a stage he had spent 40 years refusing to stand on. Both of them identified Will during the years when Diddy's operation was being dismantled in federal court, when the Epstein documents were working their way through congressional chambers toward public release, and when two people who had been inside Will's world were preparing lawsuits that would land in the same month the files dropped. Neither Jim nor Eddie named the lawsuits or the files. Both of them named the machine, and the machine, as it turned out, was the story the whole time. Janet, Bilal, and Brian had all been close enough to Will to see something, and all three stayed quiet until the cost of silence finally exceeded the cost of speaking. Does that prove Will was protected for years, or does it prove people only speak when it benefits them? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.